The courtroom air trembled with tension the moment Lieutenant Jack Carson's hand shot out like a weapon. All at once, the polished oak benches, the stale hum of fluorescent lights, and the scent of old coffee faded into the background. In one swift motion, Carson's palm collided with the lined cheek of 73-year-old Harold Greene, an act born not of self-defense, but of raw contempt. The reverberating crack felt seismic, a sound that split the room in two, marking the boundary between power and prejudice. Blood spattered across Harold's silver-rimmed glasses, each crimson droplet a testament to the cost of standing one's ground in a world too quick to silence black voices. If this shocked you, hit subscribe, leave a comment below, and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss what comes next in this unfolding saga. The sun had barely crept over the courthouse roof when Harold Greene stepped into the marble-columned atrium, his cane tapping a slow rhythm across the terrazzo floor. At 73, he moved with the deliberate grace of a man who had weathered storms far fiercer than early morning staircases. His navy blazer, buttoned neatly despite the summer heat, was pinned with a faded service medallion from his days on the assembly line, proof that dignity could outlast factory whistles and scrutiny alike. Behind him, the gallery filled with murmurs, neighbors in sweat-stained polos, elderly church ladies clutching prayer beads, a handful of law students scribbling notes in leather portfolios. All had come expecting a standard small claims hearing over property lines and plumbing disputes. None expected to witness what would soon become the defining moment of Harold's quiet life. At precisely 9:15 a.m., Judge Marisol Vega called the court to order. Her voice, resonant and calm, carved through the chatter like a blade. "Mr. Greene, please approach the bench." Harold rose, cane in hand. Each step measured his spine straight, as if bolstered by unseen scaffolding. He met the judge's gaze with unflinching eyes, eyes accustomed to injustice, and yet still brimming with unbowed resolve. Then from the side pews, Lieutenant Jack Carson emerged. Carson's reputation preceded him, a 10-year veteran of Metro PD, decorated for exemplary service, though whispered rumors spoke of nights where his badge gleamed too brightly over broken bodies. Today, his uniform was immaculate, crisp crease in his trousers, polished nameplate, the kind of precision that broadcasts power rather than protection. He strode forward, boots echoing like drumbeats in a funeral march. "Your Honor," Carson began, voice clipped with authority, "I believe the plaintiff is in contempt for disrupting court proceedings." His gaze flicked to Harold, a flash of disdain passing behind his aviator sunglasses despite the indoor setting. Harold waited, composed. He had served this country long before Carson had pulled on that uniform, and he was no stranger to the indignities that came with darker skin and advancing years. Still, he'd never imagined a lawyer-turned-cop would weaponize the law so literally. "What disruption?" Judge Vega asked, eyebrow-arching in challenge. Harold's soft voice cut through the tension. "I merely rose to answer your summons." "Your Honor," he said, lifting his chin slightly. "If that constitutes disruption, then justice itself is in contempt." A hush fell, the silence so thick it pressed at the ears. Carson's jaw clenched. He stepped forward, palm flexing. "Sit down, old man," he barked, each word laced with contempt. "You're out of line." In that heartbeat, Harold saw the contempt not just in Carson's voice, but in the very set of his shoulders, the predatory gleam in his eyes. He could have retreated, could have molded himself smaller to protect the frail body that still bore scars from a youth spent fighting for rights others took for granted. But he did not. He stood taller. Carson's response was reflexive. His arm launched like a battering ram. The resounding smack was pure, unfiltered violence. Harold's head snapped sideways. His knees buckled before he caught himself, cane clattering against the bench. Blood welled from the corner of his mouth, trickling onto the courtroom floor like a damning punctuation mark. Gasping, the judge slammed her gavel. "Officer Carson, step back this instant." Her voice thundered. Yet Carson remained unfazed, wiping his palm on his uniform as though he'd merely dusted off a speck of lint. The courtroom froze. A woman in the back row wept softly. A young man raised his phone, capturing every frame. But no one dared to move forward. They seemed trapped by the raw spectacle of brutality beneath sanctified arches. Carson's eyes locked onto Harold's, a predator eyeing its prey. And then with a final hiss, he turned and resumed his seat. chest heaving not with remorse, but with the satisfaction of unchallenged dominance. Judge Vega's gavel pounded again more urgently this time. "Court is adjourned," she declared, her face ashen. "Security escort Officer Carson from the premises, and bring Mr. Greene medical aid." As uniformed bailiffs closed in on Carson, he allowed himself a self-satisfied smirk. But he did not look at Harold, did not glance at the blood-spattered glasses lying on the bench. Instead, he stared at the silent congregation as if daring any soul to rise in protest. Yet one man did move. From the final row, FBI Special Agent Daniel Greene, the victim's son, stood slowly, his eyes cold and resolute. He did not shout, did not fling himself forward. He merely watched each breath controlled as the doors swung shut behind his father's assailant. In that moment, Daniel's silence spoke volumes, a vow that this strike would not fade into the endless echo of unpunished violence. Outside, the morning light glinted off the courthouse steps. Daniel did not step into it. He sank back into the shadows of the hallway, his mind already racing through legal codes and digital evidence. The snap of his father's neck was more than a slap. It was a summons. And Daniel Greene never ignored a call to justice. The echo of the gavel still reverberated in Daniel Greene's ears as he pressed his palms flat against the cool marble of the back row bench. Around him, the courtroom was a frozen tableau. Judge Vega's stern features alive with outrage, bailiffs converging on Carson and Harold Greene, cradling his handkerchief against a bleeding lip. Yet Daniel felt nothing but the steady thrum of purpose in his chest. He had trained for moments like this, scenarios flickering through his mind during long nights, poring over case files, simulations that tested his resolve, but nothing could have readied him for the raw, unfiltered contempt on Carson's face in that instant. He remained perfectly still, every muscle clenched, as if the slightest movement might shatter the fragile tension. Through the corner of his eye, Daniel saw the smear of blood on his father's glasses, the way it caught the light like a cruel jewel. A camera-flash cell phone or courtroom camera he couldn't tell snapped somewhere in the gallery. He did not flinch. Instead, he let his senses sharpen cataloging details with the precision of an investigator, the precise angle of Carson's palm in midair, the way the uniform's fabric creased under the force, the shudder in Judge Vega's gavel hand as she struggled to regain control. When Carson finally allowed himself a smug smile, his victory sealed with that single act of violence, Daniel's eyes flicked to the silent spectators around him. He saw a young clerk stare with a mixture of horror and fascination, a lawyer whispering urgently into a phone, an elderly woman blink back tears. No one moved to intervene. No one followed Judge Vega's order for medical aid until the bailiffs shoved Carson aside. Their inaction was deafening a complicity born of fear. Daniel understood in that moment that the real crime was not just Carson's slap, but the cowardice that allowed it. His thoughts snapped forward to the task at hand. He was not here to negotiate, to argue procedure, or to plead justice with words. He was here to gather proof. His father, dignified in the face of humiliation, had laid down a gauntlet. Daniel would answer it. As the bailiffs roughly escorted Carson out of the courtroom, Daniel slipped from his seat, his movement as quiet as a shadow. No handshake, no whispered confidences, just a measured exhalation and the quiet click of his badge against his belt. Outside the courtroom doors, the corridor was a flurry of activity. Reporters clustered near the entrance, their microphones thrust forward like bayonets. Jurors filed out with bowed heads, clutching notepads stained with Hawes' heavy coffee rings. Daniel parted the throng without a word, his eyes fixed on the flight of steps leading up to the judge's chambers. He wanted to speak to the clerk in charge of the official records. He wanted the original video feed. He wanted every angle and timestamp. He found the clerk, a young woman with dark circles beneath her eyes, lining up folders on a cart. Daniel offered his badge and clearance without preamble. FBI. "I need the raw courtroom video feeds," he said, voice low but unwavering. She hesitated, glancing toward the gallery doors where Carson had disappeared. He met her gaze and nodded once. She led him through a maze of side hallways, past locked doors marked evidence and judicial archives, until they reached a small anteroom where racks of videotape and digital servers hummed. Daniel's fingers danced over the touchscreen interface. He keyed in the case number, his heart thumping in time with the humming drives. Footage from 3 cameras populated the screen. One behind the judge, one elevated above the gallery and one fixed on the defense counsel's table. He pressed play and watched Carson's arm wind back like a longbow, the slap unfolding in slow-motion horror. Again, nothing prepared him for the way it resonated like a personal attack, a deliberate attempt to erase everything his father represented. He paused, rewound, and zoomed in on the exact frame where Carson's palm met flesh. The officer's sunglasses captured a distorted reflection of Harold's eyes, widening in shock. Daniel snapped a series of stills and transferred them to his secure drive. He marked the timestamp 09/17/42. Later, this moment would be dissected frame by frame. Today, it was a starting point. When Daniel finally closed the terminal, he felt the weight of the evidence settle into his bones. But he didn't linger for triumph. He knew that gathering proof was only the first step. Next came the building of an unassailable legal case, one that would leave no margin for doubt or bureaucratic evasion. He filed back into the hallway, his pace unhurried but resolute. Back in the main foyer, the reporters swarmed around a deputy marshal clamoring for statements. Daniel slipped a hand into his coat pocket, where his encrypted phone vibrated with messages from headquarters. He scanned the brief communiques, begin background check on Carson, pull IA files, coordinate with U.S. Attorney's Office. Satisfied, he pocketed the device. He would handle all that in due time. For now, he needed to see his father. Harold Greene sat on the bottom step of the courthouse staircase, head bowed as paramedics bound a blood pressure cuff around his wrist. Daniel paused, giving his father a moment's grace before approaching. Harold looked up, one side of his face stiff with pain, but his eyes alight with the same unbreakable calm Daniel had admired since childhood. No shame, no bitterness, only the quiet assurance that justice could still be reclaimed. Daniel knelt down beside him, placing a steadying hand on his father's shoulder. "I've got it," he said softly. Harold offered a slight nod, his grip on Daniel's forearm firm. In that touch, Daniel felt the full weight of responsibility, not just as a son, but as an agent sworn to uphold the law. They rose together. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the columned façade, as if the building itself were bowing under the magnitude of what had transpired. Daniel led his father toward a waiting car, plans already unfurling in his mind. Forensic interviews, subpoenas for medical reports, calls to digital forensics experts. He would build a fortress of facts around this single act of brutality, brick by relentless brick. As the sedan's doors closed, Daniel allowed himself a moment to exhale. He watched the courthouse steps recede through the tinted window, the site of the crime that had ignited his mission. He thought of all the people who had looked away, who had pressed their lips shut in the face of cruelty. His resolve hardened. They would not be allowed to do so again. In the privacy of the car, Daniel tapped out a secure memo subject, Carson Jack allegation, excessive force resulting in bodily harm. He attached the first batch of still frames and video clips encrypted and time-stamped. Then he composed a note to Assistant U.S. Attorney Morales Priority Review requested. Evidence of on-camera assault by law enforcement officer. Immediate meeting recommended. Outside the city carried on. Commuters hurried past hot dog stands, bus doors hissed open, and the swell of midday traffic rose in a steady roar. But inside that car, time felt suspended, measured in the beats of Daniel's heart and the hum of the engine. He was no longer just the unseen witness. He was the catalyst for accountability, a man determined to pry open the system's blind eye and force the truth into the light. The car pulled away from the courthouse, leaving behind the vaulted arches and silent observers. As the city grid unfurled before him, Daniel planned his next move: secure the surveillance feeds, convene with internal affairs, and prepare for the inevitable pushback from an institution unaccustomed to being checked. He reached over and squeezed his father's hand. "We'll make them pay attention," he vowed. Harold Greene inclined his head, a slight smile flickering at the corner of his mouth, despite the pain. In that exchange, father to son, survivor to guardian, Daniel found the final piece of his conviction. He would be the relentless force that turned a single savage strike into a reckoning the system could not deny. And so as they sped toward a quiet office where justice would be drafted into motion. Daniel Greene sat back, eyes focused straight ahead, the weight of witness settling into a promise he intended to keep. Harold Greene felt every eye in the courtroom drift away from him, settling instead on the polished oak panels and the black robes of Judge Vega, as if they alone could hold authority. He stood at the center of that silent stage handkerchief pressed to his lip, the fabric crisp white against the dark stain of blood. His spine felt like iron stiffened not by vanity, but by necessity. In that moment he knew that if he bent even a fraction, he would concede more than dignity. He would concede the right to be heard at all. A hush lingered heavier than any spoken word. The judge tapped her gavel once, loud enough to shatter the tension, but not so loud as to frighten the frail hearts of those who still feared speaking out. "Court will resume," she said, voice measured. Her eyes flicked to the bailiff standing guard over Carson's empty seat. "Officer Carson will be held in contempt. Bailiff C to Mr. Greene." But no bailiff moved to help him. Instead, they stared at the blood glistening on his lip as if unsure whether he was victim or culprit. So Harold lowered his hand, folded the handkerchief neatly in his palm, and set it atop the bench's edge. He did not wince. He did not tremble. He simply breathed in, let the stale courtroom air fill his lungs, and met Judge Vega's gaze. The judge's eyes softened just enough to acknowledge his pain, then hardened again against a system that too often overlooked men like Harold, men who wore their years in wrinkles and who carried family names heavier than most shields. "Mr. Greene," she said, "are you able to continue?" He nodded. His throat caught not with fear but with the weight of having to speak in a room where voices rarely rose for people who looked like him. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, voice clear and deliberate. Even as he spoke, a memory flickered through his mind, the Civil Rights March in Birmingham when he was 19, the taste of tear gas on his tongue, and the sound of protest songs bleeding into church hymns. There had been slaps then, too. Blows from billy clubs, and jeers that cut deeper than any fist. But he had stood firm, teaching the world that some injustice demanded to be seen, not shouted down. Today was no different. The courtroom clerk shuffled papers behind her stamping exhibits with a milky gavel. She slid a packet across to Judge Vega, who nodded and pushed it toward the defense table. Harold watched as Carson's attorney, fresh-faced blazer, crisply ironed, plucked the packet up and began leafing through it. He saw the fear in that lawyer's eyes. It wasn't fear for Carson's fate, but fear for the system cracking open in front of everyone. In their world, truth was usually a private matter buried beneath privilege. Here it lay bare, slick as blood. Daniel Greene, seated just behind the defense counsel, remained a silent sentinel. He'd slipped back into the courtroom after securing the raw footage, his presence a quiet promise to his father. "I've seen this. I will not forget." Now he watched as legal procedure crept forward, each motion and objection, a gear in the slow machinery of justice. While his father embodied dignity under fire, Daniel embodied resolve at every step, his mind cataloging each rule, each statute that could turn this moment into a turning point. Judge Vega tapped the gavel again to focus the room. "We will hear from the bailiff who witnessed the incident." The bailiff rose, posture stiff badge, reflecting the overhead light. His testimony would be factual, detached. "I saw Officer Carson strike the plaintiff, but detached couldn't capture the texture of humiliation on Harold's face or the weight of every wide-eyed stare in that hall." When the bailiff finished, the judge turned to Carson's attorney. "Your cross-examination." The lawyer's voice quivered, betraying his reliance on procedure rather than morality. "Is it not standard protocol for a civilian to remain seated unless directed otherwise?" "Your Honor," he asked, Harold's voice laced with insinuation. Harold inhaled slowly. He could have explained, could have recounted the exact words the judge spoke before calling him forward. But he knew a verbal sparring match would yield little. Instead, he leaned back, his silhouette framed by the tall Gothic windows. "I did exactly as instructed," he said softly. "I rose because I was asked to approach the bench." The courtroom's hush deepened. Even Carson, seated now at the defense table after being admonished to stay away from the bench, looked momentarily unsettled, his eyes narrowing as he realized the clarity of Harold's simple truth. He had broken no rule. Carson had broken him. As witnesses gave their testimony, court reporters tapping keys like machine gun fire lawyers pressing for technicalities, Harold kept his focus inward. He recalled his wife's soft humming when he returned from long shifts, the warmth of their kitchen, and the promise he made to her on her deathbed to live a life of integrity, no matter the cost. He would not let one vile act erase decades of that promise. Outside the courtroom doors, the murmur of the courthouse formed a low rumble, lawyers strategizing, journalists gossiping, security guards exchanging text messages. But inside time crawled. Judge Vega paused at intervals to confer with both sides, her wig bobbing slightly as she said, "Sustained or overruled," each decision rippling through the room. Through it all, Harold remained a pillar, stoic and unbowed. When it came time for Daniel to present the video evidence, the courtroom lights dimmed. A single projector cast a grainy image onto the wall, Lieutenant Jack Carson's palm winding back the slow-motion replay, highlighting the terrible precision of his strike. The courtroom gasped as the impact frame froze, blood pulsing in a cruel arc across Harold's glasses. Some faces turned away, others stared transfixed. Carson's jaw tightened. The first real flicker of remorse or perhaps fear flitted across his features. Harold did not flinch. He watched the scene as if viewing a distant storm, his posture unwavering. And when the tape ended, leaving the frame frozen on cruelty, he raised his handkerchief once more, dabbed at the remnant drop of blood, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Not out of pride, but to prepare for what came next. The judge called a short recess. The gavel's echo faded, replaced by whispers and chairs scraping on tile floors. Lawyers clustered, whispering strategy. Jurors leaned forward, reviewing notes. Daniel rose and approached his father. In that brief interlude, they exchanged no words, just a hard nod, a shared breath. No comfort was needed. Their mission was clear. When the proceedings resumed, Judge Vega addressed the jury. "You have witnessed the facts. I remind you to consider the weight of evidence over emotion." She recited the legal standards for excessive force under color of law, and the jury shifted pens poised over verdict forms. Harold seated himself, cane resting against the bench, his eyes fixed on the far wall as if seeing through it to a horizon where justice might finally land. Daniel remained standing until the judge's eyes swept the courtroom. Then he slipped back into his chair, arms folded, mind racing with the next steps, securing medical reports, lining up expert witnesses, preparing for internal affairs inquiries. His father's quiet resolve had set the stage. Now he would ensure the stage held firm. As the day wore on, the courtroom atmosphere shifted from stunned hush to focused determination. Each witness, each exhibit, each legal argument piled upon the next building an undeniable case. Through it all, Harold's presence radiated a kind of calm power proof that violence alone could never silence a man who refused to shrink. At last, Judge Vega adjourned for the day. The gavel's final strike sent ripples through the hushed room. Attorneys gathered their files. Jurors packed their notebooks, and reporters dashed to their keyboards. But Harold remained seated, gathering his coat cane and handkerchief with deliberate care. Daniel rose and offered his arm, which Harold accepted with a grateful nod. They walked down the aisle together side by side as the gallery emptied. Carson, flanked by his attorney, watched them pass, his expression unreadable. Harold did not glance back. He focused instead on the exit doors, on the clear blue sky beyond, and on the promise that the law would follow through where a single gavel strike had failed. Outside, the late afternoon sun lay golden on the courthouse steps, but Harold did not linger for its warmth. He and Daniel crossed the plaza, moving through clusters of reporters who shouted questions into microphones. Harold simply shook his head, refusing interviews. Daniel quietly guided him to their car. In that shared silence, they carried the day's events as both burden and beacon proof that quiet resolve met with unwavering action could force the world to take notice. As the car eased away, Harold stared out at the receding courthouse. His cheek throbbed and blood still lingered on his handkerchief, but he felt lighter than he had in years. The law had been summoned not just by slaps and video reels, but by the steadfast refusal to be broken. And while the system's gears were slow to turn, he knew they had begun to move, and that more than anything was worth the pain. Daniel Greene closed the unmarked sedan's door with a soft click that sounded oddly final. Inside the cabin was dim lit only by the pale glow of the dashboard screen. He settled into the passenger seat where he kept his mobile forensic workstation, slid the laptop out of its protective case, and connected it to the car's secure data link. A quiet hum rose from the hidden servers beneath the dashboard as the secure channel authenticated his credentials. In that low, steady drone, Daniel felt the charge of purpose twist in his gut. He tapped the screen once, then again, and the first feed appeared a wide-angle shot from the courthouse's gallery camera. He rewound the timestamp to 09:17:35, just before Carson's palm unfurled into violence. Daniel's finger hovered over the play button. He exhaled, then pressed enter. The grainy footage stuttered forward. In slow motion, Carson's arm arced through the air with brutal precision, his uniform's fabric creasing like the bellows of a growling machine. Daniel paused the frame at 09:17:42. On the screen, Carson's palm was inches from Harold Greene's cheek. He zoomed in pixel by pixel until he could see the tension in Carson's knuckles, the knurling of the officer's watch catching the light. He toggled to the second feed, an overhead camera perched in the ceiling. From that angle, the raised blood spurt painted a dark ribbon across Harold's silver-rimmed glasses. Daniel marked the frame, tagged the timestamp, and saved it to his encrypted drive. Then he switched to the third angle mounted near the defense table where he could see the ripple of shock that passed over Carson's attorney when the blow landed. Each perspective told a slightly different story. One showed the precise trajectory of the strike. Another revealed the collective gasp from the courtroom gallery. The third captured the moment Judge Vega's gavel trembled in her hand. Daniel played them in sequence, watching the same act of aggression unfold like a grim choreography. He watched until the footage looped 3 times, until every nuance burned into his mind. Carson's lip curling in a predator's sneer, the slow arc of motion, the sudden jerk of Harold's head, the spread of crimson across clear lenses. He didn't release the breath he'd been holding until the loop restarted. Then he began cataloging. For each angle, he noted the camera ID, the precise timestamp, and any anomaly shadows that might obscure the strike potential obstructions in the gallery. Seats the exact moment the judge's gaze shifted. He flagged the frames where Carson's uniform badge glinted white-hot, as if to underscore that this was not a man acting in the heat of the moment, but an officer wielding his authority like a cudgel. As the last frame solidified on the screen, Daniel tapped another command, extract metadata. Within seconds, the software parsed each file displaying creation and modification dates, camera firmware versions, and GPS coordinates. Even the tilt angles of the ceiling-mounted camera were recorded. He cross-checked the data with his own log of building schematics to confirm there had been no chance of feed tampering. Everything was intact, untainted evidence of raw brutality. Without pause, he initiated a secondary pull the courthouse internal security feed. This was a restricted system, separate from the public cameras. He entered the override code in alphanumeric string only 3 people in the FBI knew and waited as the dark interface flickered. Then several more angles appeared, a narrow shot of the hallway outside the courtroom door, a side angle that caught the movement of the bailiffs, and a close-up mounted above the defendant's bench. He scrolled through these feeds, scanning for anything the public footage might have missed the moment Carson paused before striking the hesitation of the bailiffs, the staccato tap-tap-tap of a law clerk's fingers on the microphone. One snippet stood out, Carson's boots shifting as he repositioned himself as though checking to see if the act registered on the cameras. Daniel froze the frame and zoomed in. The officer's eyes flicked upward, meeting the lens for a split second, an unconscious glance that betrayed both arrogance and the expectation of impunity. That frame would become Exhibit B in every legal motion to follow. He compiled the selected clips into a single folder labeled Greene vs. Carson, Exhibit 1, and encrypted it with a secondary passcode. Then he drafted a secure transmission to Assistant U.S. Attorney Morales, attached, are forensic clips from courthouse feeds. Request priority review for inclusion and petition for injunction. Please confirm receipt. He hit send before anyone could second-guess his choice of words. A moment later, his phone vibrated. Morales' acknowledgement received. Will review immediately. Daniel allowed himself a brief nod of satisfaction. The wheels of justice were not known for speed, but they turned inexorably once set in motion. Next, he accessed the courthouse network's call logs, hoping to correlate the strike with any radio traffic or code calls. He filtered for any channel announcements around 09:17:00. A single entry appeared, Officer Carson en route courtroom, code 5. No mention of disturbance or need for backup. He flagged it. The absence of protocol for de-escalation would speak volumes in front of a judge, unaccustomed to officers bypassing procedure. Shifting back to the video, Daniel replayed the moment from the hallway camera that showed Carson re-entering the corridor, chest heaving, hand brushing at his uniform as if brushing away a speck of dust. There was no sign of regret, only the predatory stride of a man convinced he'd reminded the world of its place. He cataloged that too. Then he tapped into the public city CCTV network. Outside the courthouse entrance, a pair of street cameras offered a wide shot of the plaza. Daniel scrubbed through the footage looking for moments when Carson might have lingered, moments the courtroom angles missed. He found one after the strike. Carson paused at the top of the steps, surveyed the crowd, then strode toward his patrol car. In the street cam feed, you could see his reflection flicker in the tinted windows of a passing taxi, an image of a badge-bright storm. Daniel took a screenshot, labeled it Exhibit C, and moved on to the courthouse's internal microphone logs. 4 seconds of ambient audio had been captured: a sharp exhale from the judge, a soft cough from a clerk, the telltale pop of the handkerchief opening. He enhanced the audio waveform, isolating the single gasp that rippled through the gallery. It was a gasp of collective shock, a witness to cruelty. He attached the .wav file for transcription. At this point, the car's engine ticked as it cooled, and the late afternoon sun slanted through the tinted windows. Daniel paused, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. He was gathering every piece of the puzzle: video angles, audio bites, metadata call logs. But justice would demand context, too. The medical report that quantified Harold's injuries, the officer's payroll records showing Carson's years of complaints, the hidden internal affairs files where prior misconduct had been unsubstantiated. He opened a secure portal to the FBI's headquarters database. His login spooled a list of documents: IA complaints from 2015, 2018, and 2021, all against Carson. Each concluded with the same phrase: insufficient evidence. He downloaded the full transcripts, redacted the names of witnesses, and appended them to his evidence folder under Carson complaints. Here was the pattern: a history of shielded brutality, now sealed by a new, undeniable strike. Daniel's phone buzzed again, scheduled meeting reminder with the digital forensics team at HQ. He tapped the alert and confirmed attendance. Tomorrow, the analysts would help him reconstruct a 3D model of the courtroom, enabling expert testimony on line of sight and force trajectory. He added a note to bring the metadata files. He leaned back, exhaled slowly, and gave his shoulders a quiet shake. The detailed forensic work was draining but necessary. Each byte of data, each frame of footage was a building block in the case against Carson. No more gray areas, no more, he said. He said clashes. The evidence would speak in cold, clinical clarity. Before leaving the sedan, Daniel ran one final check. He opened the FBI's secure email channel and sent a priority alert to the Internal Affairs Division of Metro PD. New evidence in Carson investigation. Recommend temporary suspension pending investigation. Forwarding forensic package now. It wasn't his usual role to request departmental action, but in a case like this, protocol demanded swift response. He closed the laptop, stowed it back in its case, and allowed himself a single moment of reflection. The sun had dipped behind the city skyline, and the world outside the car carried on streetlights, flickered on horns, honked in the distance, and the hum of evening traffic rose with the promise of homebound commuters. But for Daniel, the night would continue. There were briefs to draft, evidence to organize, and allies to brief. The digital forensics phase was complete, but the legal battle was only just beginning. As Daniel stepped out of the sedan, he looked up at the courthouse facade, the stage of the crime, the repository of centuries of justice and failure. He felt no triumph in that gaze, only the sober conviction that each piece of data he'd collected would not merely document brutality, but demand accountability. He closed his eyes, briefly, drew in a breath of cool evening air, and exhaled with purpose. Inside the courthouse, the lights still burned. Somewhere, Judge Vega reviewed transcripts. Somewhere else, Harold Greene planned for tomorrow's medical exam. And Daniel, FBI Special Agent son witness, gathered his gear and walked toward the building's rear entrance. Dawn would bring more hearings, more testimony, and the relentless drive to ensure that the strike he'd so meticulously cataloged would not become another anonymous whisper in the corridors of power. He tapped his badge against his hip, a quiet reminder of his duty. The evidence was primed, the story irrevocable. Now he would summon the law to do its work. And in that summons lay the promise of justice for his father and for every man who dared to stand tall. Daniel eased the front door closed behind him, the late evening light slipping away as he crossed the threshold into the familiar hush of home. The tile floor was cool beneath his loafers, and the faint scent of simmering stew drifted from the kitchen. He loosened his tie and laid his suit coat over the back of a wooden chair, every muscle in his shoulders still taut from the day's tense courtroom and the meticulous forensic work that followed. He could hear his father's slow, measured footsteps before Harold appeared in the doorway, one hand pressed to his lip beneath a clean handkerchief. "Dinner's ready," Harold said, voice gentle but carrying the weight of every year he'd spent fighting for dignity. He gestured to the small table set for two, its surface pitted with years of family dinners, half-remembered arguments, and moments of quiet triumph. Daniel slid into his seat opposite his father, gratitude churning in his gut. After the day's strain, the simple ritual of sharing a meal felt like an anchor. Harold served him a helping of thick soup, its savory broth dotted with tender vegetables and shreds of meat. Daniel lifted the spoon but paused before tasting, watching the steady rise and fall of his father's chest. Each breath was measured, deliberate habit from decades of training in stoicism. He'd seen that same resolve etched into Harold's face during civil rights marches long before Daniel was born. But tonight, it carried a sharper edge, the edge of unfinished business. At last, Daniel took a sip of the soup, letting the warmth settle in his chest. "Dad," he began, voice low against the silence, "I got everything. 3 angles of the strike metadata, courthouse, mic logs, even street cam footage. I'm sending it all to Morales tonight." Harold nodded, lips pressed in a firm line. He set down his spoon and reached into his breast pocket. The handkerchief came away folded around something flat and storied. He unfolded it gently, revealing a black and white photograph. The edges were curled and frayed, the image faded in spots where the paper had been bent. Daniel leaned forward as Harold slid it across the table. It was a scene from March 1967, a sea of determined faces marching down a narrow Birmingham street. Placards raised high equal rights now. End segregation. Voting is a right. And at the center, a younger Harold Greene stood shoulder to shoulder with a Baptist minister in a dark suit, their expressions resolute. Patches of light peeked through leafless oaks overhead, highlighting the steadfast faces of women and men who refused to be invisible. Daniel studied the photo, tracing the outlines of that long-ago crowd, as though searching for a phantom echo of his own life. "I remember you showing me this," he said softly. "You said it was the day you learned what true resolve looked like." Harold's eyes settled on the photograph, not on Daniel. "We stood shoulder to shoulder," he said, voice steady as the marchers behind him. "They told us to turn back. They told us the world was set and nothing we did could change it. But we refused to leave the street. We sang hymns in the face of billy clubs. We held hands when tear gas burned our lungs. We learned that dignity wasn't given. You had to take it, even if taking it meant bruises." He folded the photograph carefully and laid it beside the soup bowl, as if placing it on an altar. "This isn't about vengeance," he said, meeting Daniel's gaze for the first time that evening. "It's about stopping it." Daniel's throat tightened. He'd heard the slogan not vengeance, but prevention in training films and justice seminars, but hearing it spoken by his father felt like a reckoning. He remembered the slick steel of Carson's palm, the way it had sliced across Harold's face as though it were still an open wound. "Surgical, not savage," he whispered, echoing Harold's words. Harold inclined his head. "Violence for its own sake is no answer. It just adds another layer of blood to the history we're already drowning in." He brushed a stray lock of gray hair away from his temple. "We hurt them with truth. We hurt them with evidence. We hurt them with the knowledge that someday someone who cares will stand up and refuse to look away." Daniel let the silence settle between them, tasting his father's conviction like a potent spice. He'd grown up watching Harold channel rage into balance, teaching at the community college, by day leading voter registration drives by night, but never once throwing a punch. Now, with digital forensics in hand, Daniel felt both burdened and fortified by that legacy. "I've already lined up expert testimony on force trajectory," he said, voice even. but earnest. Dr. Matthews from GW Medical can speak to the extent of your injury, how the angle and velocity make it clear this was an assault, not a reflex. I've got command logs showing no backup was requested, no escalation code called. I'm pulling the sealed IA files now, complaints going back to 2015. He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. They tried to hide it. I'm going to make sure they can't hide anything from now on. Harold leaned back, folding his hands on the table. He watched his son with a mixture of pride and gravity. You're doing what I never could, he said. They didn't have your tools. We had to rely on eyewitnesses who dared to speak on newspapers that might bury the story in the back pages. We had faith, but it wasn't enough to force change. You have technology and the law on your side. Use it. Daniel nodded. He recalled the hum of the sedan's processors, the way the secure channel had whispered data into his laptop. Each frame of the strike was a pixel in a larger picture of systemic abuse, one he intended to shatter. I'll do it, he promised. Every bit of it. And I'll make them pay attention. The worn linoleum beneath his feet glimmered in the overhead light as Harold rose from his chair. He moved with a slow deliberation, making his way to the small cabinet above the stove. From its shelf, he withdrew a mason jar filled with dried lavender. He dropped a sprig into the simmering stew, releasing a perfumed steam that mingled with the savory aroma. We've always fought in the open, he said, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. Not because we needed the spotlight, but because shining a light prevents shadows from swallowing the truth. Daniel stood beside him, watching the lavender swirl into the stew. Tomorrow we meet with Morales and the prosecutors, he said. We'll present the video the IA files the metadata. If it's airtight, they'll have to act. And then we go public. Harold paused the spoon hovering above the pot. He turned and placed a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder. Don't let the public roar distract you, he cautioned. They'll clamor for sound bites and angry speeches. You give them facts. Let the noise come later. Daniel swallowed hard, the weight of his father's confidence settling like stone in his chest. Facts, he repeated. Precision. Restraint. Harold smiled, a ghost of the youthful determination in the March photograph. That's my boy. He dipped a spoon into the stew and offered it to Daniel. Prove that the law still works. Prove that silence can be a weapon when it's followed by action. Daniel tasted the stew, letting the rich blend of flavors steady his resolve. It will, he said softly. I promise you it will. They stood in companionable quiet, listening to the gentle simmer of the pot and the distant hum of refrigerators and the world outside these kitchen walls. The past and present lay side by side on the table, the photograph of a civil rights march, a digital drive full of ruthless clarity, a blood-stained handkerchief now folded neatly away. And between them, 2 generations of Greene men bound by a shared belief that dignity demanded defense, not with fists, but with unwavering resolve. As the kitchen clock ticked toward midnight, Daniel packed his forensic workstation back into its case. He double-checked the encrypted folders, ensuring every clip, every log, every photograph was properly locked down. Harold watched his expression calm but alert, as though he were witnessing a ceremony older than any courtroom. When Daniel zipped the case closed, he turned to his father, ready for the final instruction. Harold placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. Sleep a little, he said. You'll need your strength. Tomorrow the law will speak and we'll both be listening. Together they stood in the soft kitchen light, a photograph of protesters laid out on the table, files ready to unleash truth, and 2 men at the helm of a justice long overdue. Outside the night stretched quiet and dark. Inside the Greene legacy burned bright, unwavering purpose in the face of cruelty passed down from father to son, ready to stop the strike of injustice, once and for all. Daniel pulled his unmarked sedan into the cracked forecourt of the long-closed gas station, just as the evening sky bled from blue into ink. The flicker of a single broken neon sign cast jagged shadows across the abandoned pumps, their hoses curled like stranded snakes. He cut the engine and waited, the hum of the world beyond this empty lot falling away until all he could hear was the soft drip of leaky piping and the distant rumble of traffic on the highway. He hadn't contacted Emma Parker in days, ever since she'd slipped him that first tip about internal affairs complaints buried in the Metropolitan PD archives. Now perched on a battered metal stool beneath a canopy of peeling paint, he braced himself for what she was about to reveal. He knew her reputation, a former IA coordinator who'd grown disillusioned watching misconduct reports vanish into sealed files. She'd vanished herself from the department 2 months ago, leaving a trail of rumors and half-truths in her wake. Tonight she was here, an unexpected ally in a fight he'd waged alone since the slap in the courtroom. A pair of headlights swept across the pumps and died, and Emma emerged from the station's front door, her silhouette rigid in an oversized denim jacket. She held a small, battered USB drive in one hand, cradled like a detonator. Her face was tense, her eyes wary as though she expected an ambush. Daniel slipped out of the car and closed the door softly behind him, the click of the lock sounding loud in the hush. "Thanks for coming," Emma said, voice low as she approached. She passed the drive to Daniel without meeting his eyes. "They'll be watching these cameras. I couldn't risk going inside the IA office again." Daniel secured the drive in his jacket pocket and offered a nod. "You weren't followed." Emma shook her head, scuffing a worn sneaker against the concrete. "I ditched the tail near the metro station. They've gotten sloppy, carried by complacency. But they won't overlook this." She paused, then added, "Listen to it yourself. Better than me summarizing." He understood the caution beneath her confidence. Emma was giving him more than evidence. She was placing herself in the crosshairs. He led her around to the passenger side of the car, where he'd set up a mobile workstation just as before. The door opened on hinges that creaked like old bones, and inside the laptop lay ready on a fold-down tray, its screen dark. Daniel slid in, flipped open the lid, and connected the USB drive to the side port. The laptop whirred to life, bypassing boot screens in favor of his secure interface. Emma leaned against the car's frame, arms crossed, watching the screen glow. The files indexed themselves almost instantly, a single folder labeled Confessions, Final, Wavy. He opened the file and Carson's voice filled the car with unexpected clarity. It was a grainy recording, the background crackle of a staff break room or an evidence locker. Carson laughed first, a dry, self-satisfied chuckle that sounded colder than steel. The recording continued. "I'm telling you." Carson's voice rasped, slow and venomous. "Only reason that creep made it out was 'cause I didn't want another paperwork nightmare. I just nudged him enough, one good smack across the jaw, and watched him fold like a lawn chair, if he'd bit it too damn bad. Ain't my job to keep people breathing? Just remind them who's in charge." Daniel swallowed, heart tightening. He replayed the clip, isolating every nuance, the way Carson savored each word, the echo of rattling pipes in the background, the soft rasp of his breath between sentences. Emma's reflection flickered in the window, a witness to the unrehearsed horror of a man bragging about violence as though it were sport. Then there was that kid at the protest. Carson continued, voice dropping an octave, seething cold. "Little punk thought he was safe 'cause he was skinny. I bent him across the squad car hood, heard that snap. Should have felt something, but all I felt was power. That's the kind of reminder they need." Daniel paused the playback, letting the last words hang in the air like a Gideon's trumpet. The cabin was deathly silent, the only movement the faint ballet of streetlight shadows dancing across Emma's face. She covered her mouth with one hand as though to stop a sob, and Daniel could see the regret and rage warring in her eyes. "This is enough to bury him," he said finally. Voice calm but firm. "No jury could deny this. No internal affairs board could sweep it under the rug." Emma nodded, her shoulders slumping for the first time. "I already forwarded it to internal affairs at headquarters, but they'll stall." "You need to take it higher federal. Let the U.S. attorney see it. They can't look away." Daniel leaned forward, his jaw set. "I will." He replayed the clip one last time, then exported it into his forensic folder, encrypted and timestamped. He labeled it Exhibit D and secured it alongside the courtroom footage and IA complaint transcripts. Each piece fit together now like a seamless mosaic of brutality and cover-up. He powered down the laptop and slid it into its case. The evening air had grown colder. His breath formed small clouds in the narrow space between them. Emma shifted on her feet as though testing the ground beneath her. Daniel realized she needed reassurance that this wasn't in vain. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing coming here. This will change the game." She looked up at him, then eyes shining with more than fear. There was purpose there, too. "Promise me you'll keep me safe," she whispered. Daniel met her gaze solemn. "I will." They stood side by side in the failing light, the battered pumps and rusted signs ghostly behind them. The bloodshed in the courthouse had been public. This confession was hidden more damning because it bore Carson's own admission. Daniel thought of his father, of that calm dignity in the kitchen of Harold's charge, to be surgical, not savage. This was surgical. This was the scalpel he'd needed. "Drive safe," Emma said, stepping back. She tucked her hair behind one ear, her breath steadying. "Be careful," Daniel answered. He watched her retreat toward the station's door, then slip away into the gathering darkness. He closed the car door and started the engine, neon flickers dancing across the hood as he pulled onto the street. Inside, he replayed the confession once more as he drove back toward the city. Carson's voice had no hint of remorse, only the cold joy of relishing unchecked power. But now that power would be exposed in full. Daniel dialed Assistant U.S. Attorney Morales' secure line and left a voice message. "Emma Parker just delivered a confession audio. I'm sending it now. Call me ASAP." He didn't wait for a return call. Instead, he redirected his route toward FBI headquarters, where a team of digital analysts would authenticate the recording's origin, filter out background noise, and bolster it with a chain of custody report. Tomorrow, he'd stand in a sterile briefing room laptop open and let that audio play for a half-dozen skeptical faces until their eyes went wide, until they no longer dared deny what was on the tape. As the skyline emerged, its towers aglow, Daniel felt a grim satisfaction settle in his chest. The hidden testimony was no longer buried. It had surfaced with brutal clarity. Carson had given him the words, the laughter, the contempt. All Daniel had to do now was make sure the world heard it, and that the law responded with the force that Carson had so casually discarded. When he arrived at the secure loading dock, he pocketed the USB drives, one public, one confidential, and stepped into the cool, fluorescent-lit corridor. He passed placards warning of classified data and slid into the analytics bullpen where agents huddled over screens. Daniel set his case down, extracted the drives, and laid them out on the workbench. "You've got it," one analyst asked, swiveling in his chair. Daniel nodded. "Exhibit D, Carson's confession. Clean audio admissions of assault. Authenticate and prep report." The analyst's fingers flew over the keyboard, eyes flicking up at Daniel. "This is big." Daniel's expression remained stoic. "Make it airtight." As the team got to work, Daniel stepped back, folding his arms. In his mind, he replayed the gas station exchange. Emma's determined face, the battered drive, Carson's chilling laughter. Each element was a blow against a system built on silence and obfuscation. He tapped a message to Morales, recording authenticated. Arranging review meeting for morning. Prepare sub-summons for Carson under Title 18. Then he leaned against the bench, watching the screens flicker with waveforms and spectrograms, each one a testament to a hidden truth now brought into the light. The confession would cut deeper than any slap in the courtroom. It was a confession of pattern, of pride and brutality, of contempt for the very people sworn to serve. And Daniel Greene would make sure that confession became the clearest demonstration of why justice could not be deferred any longer. In the quiet hum of the forensics lab, he allowed himself a single breath of relief. The hidden testimony was no longer hidden. The scalpel had stripped away the protective layers, exposing the rot beneath. And now, armed with that revelation, Daniel prepared to press forward, one precise incision at a time, until the system could no longer deny the wound it had enabled. Daniel settled into the quiet glow of the late-night operations center. The steady hum of servers and the muted click of keyboards, his only companions. The rest of the bureau had emptied hours ago, but Daniel couldn't rest until every thread of this conspiracy was unraveled. He reopened the secure network terminal and navigated to the call log archive, fingers moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this too many times to count. He keyed in Officer Jack Carson's direct line, filtering the results for calls outside of normal dispatch channels, those odd after-hours rings that never showed up in official logs. As the interface loaded, an index of timestamps scrolled into view. 4 calls on the night Carson returned from a disciplinary hearing, 3 calls after an internal affairs inquiry went nowhere, and 2 calls just hours before the fatal courtroom strike. Each entry was brief, no more than 30 seconds, but the pattern was too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Daniel cross-referenced the numbers with the Bureau's secure phone registry. One matched Judge Randall Hayes's direct line patched through a private extension rarely used for public business. Another matched a burner phone registered under a shell company. He highlighted each entry and exported the metadata dial-in times, duration, originating cell tower locations, data points that would form the backbone of his case. He leaned back, screen light reflecting in his eyes, and allowed himself a moment to appreciate the significance. An officer and a judge in clandestine conversation wasn't just a conflict of interest, it was the very erosion of justice. Carson's brutality had always depended on cover-ups by people like Hayes, men who wore robes and badges and whispered in hallways so the public would never hear. Daniel shut down the archive window and opened his secure mailbox, forwarding the call log export to Assistant U.S. Attorney Claire Morales with a succinct note: "Judicial ties. Needs review." He then composed a brief for the Bureau's Chief Inspector Laura Caldwell, a woman known for her unshakable integrity. He requested an immediate briefing, hinting only that it was compelling evidence of institutional interference. His phone buzzed almost instantly. Morales's reply flashed on the screen. "Received. Standing by." Next, a notification from Caldwell herself. "Report to my office at 0230. Bring everything." It was curt, but it meant she was taking it personally. Daniel allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction before gathering his laptop, his encrypted drives, and the physical printouts. At 2:15 a.m., he slipped into Caldwell's dimly lit office. She stood behind her desk, framed by shelves of binders and case files, the soft glow of a desk lamp highlighting the sharp angles of her face. She offered a terse nod. "You came alone," she said, voice low. "I did," Daniel replied, setting his stack of documents on her desk. "I wanted to be sure of my evidence before involving anyone else." He opened his laptop and connected it to her secure terminal. The screen flickered to life, displaying a timeline view of the call logs. Caldwell leaned forward, her gaze sweeping the entries. "These times 2 in the early morning after your court hearing, 2 the night before the complaint was dismissed, and 2 just before the slap in the courtroom." Her tone held a note of disbelief. Judge Hayes Daniel clicked to reveal the judge's number and Murray County's secure phone registry confirming the line. Privileged extension, not public record. Hayes used it to call Carson directly, presumably, to coordinate how that incident would be handled. Caldwell's hand hovered over the mouse. "I need more than logs," she said. "I need content, proof of direction or collusion." Daniel nodded and extracted a secondary file. 5 short audio clips pulled from the Bureau's secure phone tap authorized under exigent circumstances. He selected the first clip and pressed play. A faint beep preceded a whispered exchange. Jack, a low voice, said unmistakably, "Judge Hayes's clipped tone makes sure he knows why we agreed to retire his complaint." "No one needs to know this happened." Carson's rough reply crackled back. "Understood, Your Honor. I'll handle it. And tomorrow we'll ensure Mr. Greene stays in his place." The words hung in the air between them, electrifying in their brazenness. Caldwell's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the pause button. She pushed out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "He said we," she murmured. "He's complicit." Daniel pulled up the second clip recorded 1 week earlier. Hayes's voice overlaid a gentle authority. "Exercise discretion, Jack. We can't have your name tied to another incident." Carson responded with a chuckle. "Their blood's already been spilled. No sense in pouring after it." Caldwell closed her eyes. "This goes to the core of our system." She reached for a folder of case files Caldwell had been keeping in the corner of her desk. Old internal affairs summaries marked "Sealed, do not disclose." She handed one to Daniel. "See this file? The protester strangulation complaint. They marked it closed due to external interference. Now we know whose interference." Daniel flipped through the summary. Strangulation allegations dismissed. No witness could be located, no video found. He tapped his finger on the single line reading, "External interference judiciary directive." "That's Hayes's doing," he said. "And that was a month before he made these calls." Caldwell's face hardened. "We have to move fast." She reached for the secure phone on her desk and dialed a 3-digit code. The line connected to an internal oversight channel. "This is Inspector Caldwell. I need immediate clearance to present this material to the Federal Judicial Conduct Board. Yes, all evidence, including audio logs and call metadata. No delays. As she spoke, Daniel slipped back to his laptop and consolidated all files into a single encrypted package. He added a manifest and chained them together so any tampering would be immediately evident. He labeled the bundle Hayes Conspiracy Package and initiated a transmission to the FJCB's secure address. Caldwell ended her call and turned to him. "Let them parse this," she said, her voice resolute. "If we're lucky, they'll move to suspend Hayes pending a thorough inquiry." She paused, then added quietly, "I'm sorry it took this much. Your father, your investigation, Emma's testimony. But now we have the full picture." Daniel closed the laptop and secured it. He felt a surge of gratitude for Caldwell's decisive action. "Thank you," he said. "This changes everything." They stepped out of her office into the silent corridor. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long, cool shadows. Daniel paused at the doorway. "What about Morales?" he asked. Caldwell looked at him, her expression uncharacteristically thoughtful. "By the time she reviews the transcripts in the morning, the FJCB will already have jurisdiction over Hayes. Then it falls to the U.S. Attorney to press charges or recommend recusal or both." She nodded once firmly. "I'll coordinate with her right after this. But tonight you go home and make sure you rest. Tomorrow, the real work begins." Daniel nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time since Harold's slap, he felt the tide turning. "I will." He extended his hand. Caldwell clasped it briefly, a gesture of partnership. By the time Daniel returned to his car, the night had deepened into a velvet calm. He retrieved Emma's confession audio, the courtroom footage, the IA files, and now the Hayes package. Everything essential to expose the rot at every level, from officer to judge, rested in his encrypted drives. He sat behind the wheel, hands on the steering wheel, and allowed himself a moment to process the magnitude of what lay ahead. This was no longer just a case about one slap. It was about dismantling a network of power that had shielded brutality for years. And now, armed with incontrovertible evidence, he was going to pull every lever available. He sent one last secure message to Morales evidence delivered to FJCB. "Expect motion for judicial recusal and federal obstruction charges. Ready when you are." His phone beeped with her response. "Understood. I'll be at HQ by 8:0800. Daniel started the engine and drove off into the pre-dawn darkness, the city lights winking around him like distant promises. In his rearview mirror, the courthouse steps receded into shadow. No longer a lone stage for unchecked power, but the first domino in a reckoning that would reach every corner of the system. And as the road stretched ahead, Daniel Greene felt the quiet satisfaction of a mission finally coming into focus. There would be obstacles and delays, denials, and red tape. But he had the evidence, the law, and an unlikely ally in Laura Caldwell. Above all, he had his father's unwavering belief that restraint and precision could stop violence in its tracks. He pressed his foot to the accelerator and vanished into the city's pulse, already mapping out the next steps, filing the federal complaint against Hayes, coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and ensuring that no one, no matter how cloaked in robes or badges, could hide behind the walls they'd erected. The conspiracy had been unearthed. Now justice would have its day. Daniel stepped into the austere conference room on the third floor of the U.S. Attorney's building, the early morning light filtering through narrow blinds. Assistant U.S. Attorney Claire Morales stood beside a long mahogany table strewn with laptops and printed documents. She held a base file in one hand, her brow knotted with concentration. Daniel crossed the threshold badge, clipped to his belt, catching a sliver of sunlight. "Morning," he said quietly. Claire gave him a curt nod, but didn't pause her work. She tapped on her tablet, bringing up a draft affidavit. "Here are the charges," she said, voice even, but focused. Title 18, Section 242, Abuse of Authority under Color of Law. We list excessive force and deprivation of rights as the predicates. I've incorporated Exhibit A through Exhibit D courtroom footage, hidden confession, audio, IA complaints, and the judge's call logs. Daniel leaned over the table to peer at her screen. The affidavit was precise dates times descriptions of each incident, legal citations. "We're charging Carson with willful conduct." Claire continued, "Not just negligence. That slap was more than an isolated act. It was a pattern supported by that confession and the judge's interference." We need to show the intent to deprive Harold Greene of his constitutional rights. He tapped a foot against the polished floor. The timeline is solid, he said. 9/17/42, January 14th. Carson strikes Greene in the face, Exhibit A. March 10th, confession audio. Exhibit D, prior IA complaints. Exhibit C, calls to Judge Hayes. Exhibit B, we've got all elements covered. Color of law, deprivation of rights, willfulness. Claire nodded, eyes flicking over the text. Okay. And I've stipulated federal custody without local notification to avoid tipping off local precincts. We need him in our jurisdiction before Metro PD can intervene. Daniel drew in a breath. He won't see it coming. He picked up a printed copy of the draft warrant. The language was formal, almost surgical. Be it known that, on information and belief, it detailed Carson's office location, his rank, and the probable cause. We swear that probable cause exists to believe he violated 18 U.S.C. That's 242 by using unreasonable force under color of law, resulting in bodily injury to Harold Greene. He glanced at Claire. We have to move fast. Once Hayes' suspension goes through, we'll have the perfect opening. Claire tapped a few keys to save changes. She handed the file to Daniel. Your turn, she said. Sign here. The cursor blinked in the signature field. Daniel took a deep breath. He was both agent and affiant now. He pressed the stylus to the touchscreen and signed Daniel Greene, Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The signature appeared in crisp black ink on the digital document. Claire leaned in to initial on behalf of the United States. Claire Morales, Assistant U.S. Attorney, she wrote each letter firm. Date and time, she asked. 08:47 a.m., March 21st, 2025. Daniel replied. Claire tapped in the timestamp. The warrant was now fully executed. Claire stood and offered a hand. It's done. Her relief was tangible. This was the culmination of weeks of meticulous work. To Daniel, the moment felt electric. The pen's scratch virtual, though it was resonated in his mind like the gavel's echo. It marked the start of a process that would tear down the shield Carson had so arrogantly wielded. They exchanged a brief smile before the weight of what lay ahead settled in. Claire powered up her secure phone. I'll transmit to the clerk for the judge's signature. We'll have the warrant signed by 10 p.m. You'll be first out of the gate. Daniel nodded and gathered his laptop and evidence packages. He opened his satchel and pulled out the encrypted drives. I've notified Internal Affairs and FJCB that the warrant is coming. They're on standby for arrests and any immediate inquiries. Claire rotated to her desk. I'll copy you on the filing. Once we have the judge's signature, it's green across all channels. Local PD will stand down, no interference allowed. He reached for the door. Thank you, Claire. This means everything. Her partnership had elevated the case from a local scandal to a federal prosecution. Without her, the shield of judicial conspiracy might still hold. Claire paused in the doorway. Make sure your father knows it's moving forward. No surprises. Her tone softened and Daniel recognized a rare note of personal concern. I will, he promised. Moments later, Daniel walked through the FBI headquarters lobby, his satchel slung over one shoulder. The morning sun slanted through the glass facade, illuminating agents at their desks, analysts tuning monitors, and marshals pacing with purpose. He navigated the hallways with practiced familiarity, tapping his ID at secure checkpoints. He found his office in the Behavioral Crimes Unit. The room was modest bookcases lined with legal blue books, a whiteboard scrawled with timelines, and two empty chairs before a conference table. He set down his satchel, plugged in his laptop, and opened the file marked Carson Warrant. On the screen lay the warrant and supporting affidavit, each exhibit hyperlinked beneath legal paragraphs. He clicked through the videos and audio clips. Exhibit A played silently in the corner window, the courtroom-wide angle of Carson's strike. Exhibit D's waveform pulsed in another pane. Everything was arranged to create a seamless narrative: brutality, complicity, conspiracy. His phone buzzed. A secure message from his father prayers offered this morning at church. Call you later. Daniel allowed himself a momentary smile. Harold Greene's faith, tempered by decades of struggle, offered Daniel strength he could never quantify. He tapped a quick reply. Warrant drafted. Judge's signature pending. We move tonight. Then he forwarded the note to Claire. There was no need for fanfare, just shared understanding that the moment for action was almost here. Minutes later, his phone signaled another update Judge signed. Warrant live at 09:58 a.m. Daniel exhaled. He called Claire. Her voice crackled through the secure channel. Go. Federal custody now, and bring him in. He collected the drives, locked his desk, and strode down the hallway to the operations room. A small team had assembled 2 SWAT liaisons and IT specialist, and the team leader who would coordinate the arrest. Standing before a projection of Carson's home address and patrol patterns, Daniel laid out the plan. We have authority to take him into federal custody, no local PD notification. He's not expecting this. We move at 11:00 Team Alpha at front entrance team. Bravo to secure back exit. Emphasis on swift arrest and securing any evidence on his person, phone keys, badge. The team absorbed every detail, nodding in unison. When Daniel concluded, the room shifted from planning to execution. Radios clicked, agents checked watches, and the air crackled with the electric anticipation of justice in motion. Daniel lingered a moment before stepping back. He thought of Thatcher's March photograph of Emma's confession drive, of Caldwell's determination, and his father's resolve. Each piece of evidence had led to this warrant, an unblinking demand that the law, rather than power, prevail. At exactly 11:00, he raised his hand and signaled the start. The liaisons assembled their dark uniforms, armed, steam-lined weapons, and stepped into the corridor. Daniel exhaled, his heart settling into a steady rhythm. He would be there, badge clear against his chest, to place Carson in cuffs, to read the warrant aloud, and to carry the federal message that abuse of authority would not be tolerated. The pen scratch was no longer just a digital signature. It was the first strike in a broader campaign to restore justice, one warrant at a time. Daniel Greene watched the first notification ping on his encrypted device and felt the familiar jolt of urgency. It was 5:12 p.m., just hours after the warrant was served, and the clip of Carson's courtroom slap was already racing across the internet like wildfire. He tapped the screen, launching a secure dashboard that tracked mentions across platforms. Reddit, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram. Reddit's Justice Served subreddit had exploded. You slapped the wrong man, read the top post, its thumbnail frozen on Carson's raised palm and Harold Greene's stunned face. Comments poured in by the thousands, outrage calls for more arrests, demands to see the warrant. A moderator pinned a note. Please keep discussion civil. Savage injustice is real, but let's channel our energy into action. Down the thread, users shared links to fundraising campaigns for Harold's medical bills and for Emma Parker, whose whistleblowing had catalyzed the scandal. On TikTok, the clip was remixed with protest anthems and slow-motion filter layers that turned the raw moment into a cinematic indictment. One version overlaid text, "Policing without consequence is tyranny." Another looped Carson's arm strike, syncing each replay with the crack like a drum beat. Some videos showed side-by-side comparisons. Carson's smug smile next to clips of other officers hugging children or receiving medals highlighting the malice hidden beneath the blue. Twitter's trending page was ablaze under #WrongManSlap, #accountability, now and #Justice for Greene. Journalists, activists, and everyday users retweeted and reshared. A verified news anchor from a major network posted, "This is not a meme. It's a failure of every system meant to protect and serve." Within minutes, dozens of local and national outlets picked up the story, embedding the footage in their coverage. Live broadcasts showed panels of commentators dissecting every angle, legal experts debating Title 18 charges, ethicists decrying abuse of power, civil rights advocates placing Carson's behavior in historical context. Even within law enforcement circles, whispers replaced the usual camaraderie. Daniel received 2 encrypted messages from colleagues in IA and from agents within Metro PD. One read, "We saw it. We knew he was bad news, but until now, none of us had the courage to speak up." Another, "We've reopened old cases. Can't let him think he's untouchable. In the FBI's internal sentiment tracker, Carson's name registered 45,000 mentions in less than 6 hours, with a sentiment analysis showing 90% negative reactions. Daniel leaned back in his chair, scanning the maps of viral reach. The clip had swept beyond the city within an hour: Los Angeles, Chicago, Atlanta, then overseas. He watched as Spanish, French, and Arabic language communities reposted translations of the caption. A user in Paris wrote, "If this can happen in the US, we must examine our own forces." In Johannesburg, a tweet read, "Your courage in recording this is a gift to the world." The public conversation had already transcended one slap. It was a global demand for accountability. Yet, as the virtual uproar grew, Daniel noticed something more: subtle pockets of silence. On the Metro PD's internal bulletin board, usually a hive of gossip and gossip, there were just a few terse statements about pending investigation and no comment. The station's social media accounts, maintained by a civilian communications officer, posted carefully worded disclaimers. Allegations under review. Officer currently on leave. No one mentioned the title of the warrant. No one acknowledged the viral clip is more than a disruption. In that void, the public's imagination had filled in the blanks with righteous fury. Daniel's phone buzzed again, this time a direct message from a high-ranking official in the Department of Justice. "We're seeing unprecedented engagement. Are we prepared for potential civil unrest?" He typed back, "We have federal assets on standby. Local leadership briefed. This is about long-term reform, not chaos." He hit send before the official had a chance to retype. Around him, the operations center remained a controlled storm. A dozen analysts tracked data, updating heat maps of social media chatter by the minute. A journalist liaison from the U.S. Attorney's Office was drafting a press release weaving in key points about the Title 18 charges and emphasizing the solemnity of the federal response. Daniel reviewed their language. The Department of Justice will not tolerate abuse of authority. Crisp, authoritative, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Even Carson's own supporters had begun to fall silent. On a private forum for law enforcement personnel, posts once defending him were being removed or quietly edited. One comment, now deleted, had read, "Discipline comes in many forms. He'll be back on patrol soon." But beneath it, someone had posted a link to the viral clip with the words, "Wake up." The forum's moderator had swiftly invested the thread, banning several users for unauthorized disclosures. Yet the evidence lived on beyond any wall of silence. Daniel recognized that this viral reckoning was more than public spectacle. It was a force multiplier for justice. It amplified every piece of evidence he and Claire Morales had painstakingly assembled. The judge's call logs, Emma's confession audio, the IA complaints, all now part of the public record. The next time a court hearing convened, no juror could claim ignorance, and no community member could say they hadn't known. He leaned forward, tapping into the secure pipeline connecting his unit with the U.S. Attorney's press office. A new draft release was ready. The DOJ acknowledges overwhelming public concern. Federal authorities will proceed with a comprehensive investigation into all matters related to this case, including any patterns of abuse at Metro PD. Daniel added a note. Include a brief procedural timeline, emphasize commitment to transparency. He hit approve, and the release was queued for distribution. As the press release went live, a corresponding email blast reached hundreds of civil rights organizations, local leaders, and community advocates. Messages of solidarity flooded in. "Thank you for answering our calls," wrote a mayor from a neighboring city. "This is the moment accountability became more than a promise." Daniel forwarded some of those to Claire, who replied with a simple, "Well done." Outside, dusk had turned to night, but the city streets remained alive with protest and vigil. Drone footage broadcast on live streams showed crowds gathering near the Metro PD headquarters, some holding candles, others chanting "Justice for Greene." A line of officers stood behind barricades, visibly unsettled by the outcry. Daniel watched, heart pounding, as the chanting swelled into the night air. He knew from experience that he had to ensure order without stifling voices. The line between peacekeeping and oppression was thin. He alerted the liaison to coordinate with community organizers, ensuring the protests remained a force for change rather than descent into chaos. Back in the operations center, analysts noted a spike in search queries for report police misconduct and how to file a complaint. The viral clip had ignited not just outrage, but action, ordinary people mobilizing to hold law enforcement accountable. And Daniel understood that this momentum was fragile. If mishandled, it could evaporate into cynicism. He tapped a secure channel to the DOJ's Civil Rights Division opportunity to announce new public portal for filing IA complaints across all agencies. Recommend launching within 48 hours. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the Bureau's lobby, Daniel found Harold Greene waiting, flanked by a small group from the NAACP and local church leaders. His father's worn photograph from '67 now appeared on protest signs carried high among the crowd. Daniel guided him inside where a brief press conference was arranged. Cameras clicked as Harold, with cane in hand but voice unwavering, thanked the public for bearing witness. "This wasn't just my struggle," he said. "It's everyone's fight against the cruelty that thrives in silence. You spoke up. You made them listen." Daniel watched from behind the stage, pride and resolve surging through him. The viral reckoning had transformed one man's act of violence into a catalyst for collective action. Even as he prepared to address the next phase, coordinated reforms, new oversight committees, legislative proposals, he felt the pulse of something larger, a moment when power shifted from the few to the many. As the conference ended and the crowd filed out, lights from cell phones traced paths through the darkened room, each screen a testament to engagement, each notification a ripple of accountability. Daniel stepped forward to wrap an arm around his father's shoulders. "We're making them pay attention," he said. Harold Greene nodded, eyes shining. "And they won't forget." In that charged atmosphere, Daniel knew the course of justice had been forever altered. The viral clip was no longer just footage of a slap. It was the dawn of a new era where silence could no longer shield the powerful, and every citizen held a mirror up to the system. And as the doors closed behind them, he felt the weight of the public's gaze, not as pressure, but as purpose. The sky was a bruised indigo when Daniel pulled the last SUV into position behind the small white ranch house on Maplewood Drive. The streetlights were still sputtering their orange glow, flickering like tired sentries over rows of darkened lawns. In the driver's seat, Daniel's breath fogged the window as he glanced at his watch, 5:03 a.m., 10 minutes before first light, 10 minutes before the world would learn that even the most insulated badge could be pierced by justice. Inside the unmarked convoy, 3 vehicles and all agents moved with silent purpose. No sirens, no rotting foghorn of red lights. Only the quiet hum of engines and the soft zip of tactical jackets as each agent checked equipment one last time, evidence packets, handheld radios on muted channels, ballistic belts secured just under uniforms. Daniel himself wore plain clothes, the better to blend in, but his FBI badge nestled against his chest, a constant reminder of authority and accountability entwined. He caught a reflection in the rearview mirror, Emma Parker, stoic, despite the hour, arms crossed as she tapped her phone against her thigh. She'd agreed to witness the arrest, and her presence meant more than corroboration. It meant that the internal affairs whistleblower would stand by as the system corrected itself. Next to her, Laura Caldwell, the Bureau's chief inspector, studied the house through night-dark windows. Even at this hour, her posture radiated resolve. A stealthy knock on the window drew her attention. Daniel nodded once. Time. They slipped from their vehicles in a muted cascade of motion. Doors clicked closed. Footsteps skirted the curb. A slender beam from a mounted flashlight traced the flattened grass. Daniel felt the familiar thrill of that silent approach, calm nerves sharpened by the gravity of purpose. Each step was a choice to uphold the law with dignity, not vengeance. Carson's home was nondescript pale siding, a small front porch supported by 4 white columns, a fern in a hanging basket that swayed faintly in the chill pre-dawn breeze. Daniel paused at the sidewalk, raising his hand. A swift nod to Caldwell, then to the lead arrest team. They fanned out 2 at the front door, 2 to secure the perimeter, and a 3rd poised by the detached garage in case of an escape attempt. Daniel descended the 3 steps to the porch and placed his hand on the doorknob. He could almost hear the echo of the courtroom laughter, the slap that had launched 1,000 hashtags, the headlines that had screamed for accountability. Here, in this silent moment, he would close the circle. FBI, he announced, voice low but carrying, opened the door. Inside, headlights from the SUVs cast long shadows through the sidelights. The front door swung inward, revealing Lieutenant Jack Carson in navy pajamas, disheveled hair, a rifle, his standard-issue sidearm clutched at his side. His gaze flicked from the glowing badge on Daniel's chest to the line of agents behind him. For a heartbeat, he looked every bit the predator caught in his own lair. Daniel stepped onto the threshold. "You're under federal arrest," he said, raising the warrant. 18 U.S.C. Section 242, Abuse of Authority. I have a warrant for your arrest. You will come with us peacefully. Carson's eyes narrowed, the rifle lowering an inch. "You've got the wrong guy," he rasped, voice hoarse with disbelief. "I'm an officer of the law." "All the more reason to comply," Daniel replied, tone even. "Step back. Place the weapon on the ground and put your hands where we can see them." He was careful not to sound threatening. He wanted compliance, not chaos. Carson's jaw tightened, the rifle clattering as he released it, letting it fall muzzle first onto the rug. Agents quickly secured the weapon, their gloves snapping closed over the wooden stock. Carson pressed himself into the doorway, chest heaving as Caldwell approached with the handcuffs. The single click of her radio confirmed perimeter security was in place. Daniel produced the warrant and read aloud the critical lines, each phrase a measured declaration. In the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, on probable cause shown, you are commanded to be taken into federal custody without local notification. The words hung in the silent foyer like a sentence pronounced by the world itself. Carson's shoulders slumped as Caldwell slid the handcuffs onto his wrists, metal bit into skin tight and inevitable. He flexed his fingers against the cold steel face, contorting with a mixture of anger and disbelief as the finality of the cuffs sank in. No courtroom drama, no flares of protest, just the sound of metal clicking home. It was more definitive than any gavel. "Do you have any weapons or evidence on your person?" Daniel asked quietly. Carson shook his head. "You will be escorted to an FBI vehicle outside. You have the right to remain silent." Daniel recited, voice steady, a gift of clarity rather than a threat. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." Carson's gaze dropped to the floor, his lips moving to catch the familiar words as though tasting betrayal. Agents guided him off the porch past the ferns and the porch light now flickering in early morning gloom. Neighbors remained behind drawn blinds. The world was beginning to stir, but for the moment, this house was a stage cleared of performance. They led him to the first vehicle. Daniel opened the back door and motioned Carson in. Inside, the leather seat gleamed in the headlight's sheen. A dashcam was already recording. Carson sat head-lowered, cuffed hands folded awkwardly on his lap. Daniel closed the door and slid in beside him, leaving room for an agent on the other side. The convoy reformed and pulled away without a backward glance. Carson's house receded in the mirror, its boarded windows and silent porch now powerless to shield him. Daniel sat back, unthreatening but watchful. The ride to headquarters was short but heavy with unspoken reckoning. In the front vehicle, Caldwell relayed the arrest over secure channel primary subject in federal custody. Evidence package secured. No resistance. Heading to headquarters for processing. ETA 10 minutes. Her tone was professional, but Daniel could hear relief beneath the formality. Relief that a system built on silence and complicity was finally being tested. In the back, Carson shifted in his seat, clinking once against the window. I've got family," he muttered, voice thin as mist. Daniel turned his head slightly. "Your legal representative has been notified," he replied. "You'll have every opportunity to make your case." No malice in his voice, just fact. Justice neutral, neither grateful nor vengeful. Carson's gaze flicked to Daniel's badge in the faint dashboard glow. "You don't understand," he whispered. "This will ruin me." Daniel met his eyes in the reflection of the tinted glass. "It's not about ruin. It's about accountability." He paused. "And about preventing the next blow." Silence settled again, a companion to the hum of tires on asphalt. They passed shuttered markets and underpasses still black against the sky's morning edge. Daniel thought of Harold Greene, of the photograph from '67 of Emma Parker's battered drive, and of Judge Hayes's groveling calls. Each link in the chain had led to this moment when a man who believed himself above the law would feel its weight. At the Bureau's loading dock, the convoy pulled into a narrow bay lit by floodlights. Agents emerged swiftly to guide Carson from the vehicle now flanked by two marshals. Daniel stepped forward, handcuffs replaced by a civilian gray jumpsuit draped over Carson's shoulders. He helped him into it, securing the ties at the waist, then handed him over to the processing team. Carson paused, glancing around the cavernous dock steel walls, overhead pipes, other detainees in muted solitude. For the first time, he seemed adrift, untethered from the uniform that had once felt like armor. Daniel watched silent but present as Carson was led into the intake area. He waited until the door to the holding cell hissed closed, leaving only the steady drip of water from a nearby pipe. Then Daniel turned away, stepping into the concrete corridor that led to the processing offices. Ahead, Claire Morales waited, suit-crisp tablet in hand. She offered him a brief nod. "Warrant executed," Daniel said simply. "No complications." Claire's eyes were bright with urgency. "Good work. Now the next phase begins indictment arraignment discovery." She glanced over her shoulder toward the cell block door. "He'll get his day in court, but not his freedom." Daniel allowed himself a small breath, the tension easing just enough to feel the dawn's first light warming the corridor. "I'll get Dr. Matthews for the forced trauma report, and we need to prepare for public statements. This will dominate the headlines today." Claire nodded. "Media's already gathered outside. They'll swarm the precinct like flies." She tapped her tablet. "I'll handle the press. You handle the next evidence lockdown." They walked side by side toward the processing offices, the echo of their steps loud in the deserted building. Behind them in that downstream bay, Lieutenant Jack Carson sat against the wall, stripped of rank, clutching the gray fabric of his jumpsuit like a lifeline. The echo of the metal cuffs and the slide of the door were all the verdict he needed. Daniel paused before turning the corner. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of everything that had led here: the slap, the hidden confession, the conspiracy logs, the public outrage, the handwritten plea of a 7-year-old in crayon. Each piece had fallen into place like puzzle pieces in the night. Now, as the sun began its rise, he would watch the system with shards of its own law bring him fully into judgment. And in that moment before daybreak, Daniel Greene felt the full sweep of justice in motion. Quiet, precise, unrelenting. Beginning with the cold click of metal against skin and extending out into the world that could no longer look away. The courtroom filled with morning light as spectators settled into wooden benches, the hush broken only by the rustle of papers and the soft click of cameras being turned off. Daniel Greene sat at the prosecution table, shoulder-squared eyes, watching the door through which his father would enter. Across the aisle, Jack Carson's defense counsel whispered into his ear, their words carried on a current of desperation. At the front, Judge Marisol Vega adjusted her glasses, her gavel poised on the bench like a silent sentinel. This was the moment the entire city had been waiting for Harold Greene's testimony. When the bailiff called his name, Harold rose slowly, each movement deliberate. His cane tapped 3 times against the marble floor as he made his way to the stand, a steady rhythm, asserting presence rather than frailty. Reporters craned their necks, jurors leaned forward. No one spoke, as though aware that speech might shatter the fragile integrity of the moment. Claire Morales offered him a reassuring nod from the prosecution table. Daniel's heart steadied at that glance. His father's dignity was the cornerstone of everything they had built. At the witness box, Harold placed his hand on the Bible, his other hand clasping the rail. The clerk administered the oath in his crisp southern tones, and Harold answered, "I do," with a calm so profound it seemed to resonate in the very walls. His coat hung off his shoulders like armor shed for truth. The first question came from the prosecution brief, factual, aimed at establishing the timeline before the courtroom blow-up. Harold recounted his summons to the bench, the slight tension in the air, then the unexpected violent arc of an officer's hand. The gallery held its breath as Harold described the slap's crack, likening it to a judge's gavel, but one stripped of fairness. He did not raise his voice, did not let anger color his words. He spoke instead of the blood on his glasses, the hush that swallowed the courtroom, and the weight of knowing his own son had watched it all. His words were plain but precise, painting a vivid image with the economy of someone who had narrated injustice far too often in his mind. When the defense rose for cross-examination, a murmur rippled through the audience. Carson's lawyer was practiced. He leaned close to the microphone, voice smooth. trying to refocus the jury on legal technicalities. "Mr. Greene," he began, "did you speak before or after the officer struck you? Did you say anything that might have provoked him?" He watched Harold for a flicker of hesitation. Harold's answer was simple. I did not flinch. I simply stood and adjusted my collar. His gaze locked on the lawyer's unwavering. The words landed like a hammer strike on an anvil of expectation, silencing the room more effectively than any gavel. No defense of violence, no concession to fear, just that act of composure in the face of brutality. The lawyer tried again, softer now, probing for anything to crack that composure. "Did you move toward him afterward? Did you attempt to retaliate?" Harold's reply was equally direct. "I did not advance. I did not retreat. I stood where I was called to stand." In those few words, he reframed the narrative. What some saw as provocation was in fact dignified compliance with a court's authority unmarred by violence. Jurors exchanged looks. The stern impartiality they had been trained to maintain gave way to something more human empathy, respect, the recognition that this man embodied the very ideal of a citizen under law. The defense lawyer faltered, searching for another line of attack, but the momentum had shifted. Cameras zoomed in on Harold's steady hands, unshaken, rested calmly on the rail, each subtle gesture reinforcing his testimony's weight. Claire Morales rose to deliver a brief redirect. She revisited the videos, the confession, the call logs, but ended by inviting the jury to consider Harold's own words. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "the law demands more than force. It demands restraint and respect. Mr. Greene's simple act of adjusting his collar after he was struck demonstrates exactly what our system is meant to protect." The courtroom's energy hummed with quiet approval. When Judge Vega excused Harold, the bailiff guided him from the stand. Daniel met him at the rail, offering an arm. His father took it firmly, gratitude in his steady eyes. Reporters jostled in the aisles, eager to capture the image of dignity personified. Outside, a flashbulb popped, and echoes of Harold's words rippled across the press pool. I did not flinch. I simply stood and adjusted my collar. Within hours, social media lit up anew. Clips of his testimony spread as fast as the slap previously had. Commenters called it the most powerful 2 seconds of courtroom drama, praising Harold's calm courage. Civic forums debated the deeper meaning of composure under assault. Civil rights groups shared transcripts of his cross-examination as a manual for nonviolent resistance. Even editorial boards, once cautious, ran headlines like "Dignity Under Fire, a Lesson in True Power." Back in the jury deliberation room, 7 women and 5 men pored over notes, their faces reflecting a mixture of legal carefulness and personal conviction. No instructions from Judge Vega could suppress the image of Harold's unwavering stance. The law had been invoked witness by witness, but it was his calm testimony that crystallized their duty. That afternoon, as sunlight slanted through tall windows, the jury filed back in. The courtroom stilled. 9 voices spoke in unison. Guilty. The word carried beyond any slap or shout, resonating as a collective verdict on abuse of authority itself. Carson sat in stunned silence, the gravity of the decision unfurling in his expression. But for Harold Greene, who had met violence with poise, the verdict was the sound of justice made real. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the plaza. The banner reads, "Guilty of abusing power and a courtroom lesson in courage." Daniel and Claire emerged flanked by fellow agents and community leaders. Daniel placed a steady hand on his father's shoulder as cameras recorded Harold's brief statement. Today, the law stood for all of us. His eyes swept over the gathered crowd, capturing every uplifted face and pressed phone recording. In the days that followed, Harold's words became a citation in policy debates and law school symposia. Judges referenced his testimony when crafting opinions on police conduct. Newspapers ran columns titled, "Adjust Your Collar," how one man's calm upended impunity. Grassroots organizers held collar adjustment rallies, where citizens practiced standing tall even in the face of systemic might. Daniel watched these ripples with a quiet pride that outshone any medal. His father's modest act had done more than win a trial. It had shifted the national conversation on respect, restraint, and the real meaning of power. The story that began with a slap had transformed into a lesson that would echo long after headlines faded, a lesson anchored by a simple, unshakable truth: when faced with violence, dignity can be the most formidable weapon of all. The morning after the sentencing, Daniel arrived at the courthouse before dawn, stepping into a lobby still hushed from yesterday's finality. A small cluster of reporters lingered, but life in the city had already begun to stir. Delivery trucks rattling down side streets, joggers tracing familiar loops in the wake of streetlights. Inside, the air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and new carpet, and the marble steps beneath his feet held the imprint of stubborn consequence. Jack Carson's name still echoed in the halls. The man who once wielded a badge like a weapon now carried only a gray jumpsuit and a 25-year term. But Daniel's work wasn't done. If anything, this was when the real challenge began, ensuring that Carson's fall would ripple outward, reshaping a system too long unchallenged. He stepped into Judge Vega's office, where a meeting of legislative aides and policy advisors had assembled. On the long table lay thick binders stamped Audit Trail Reform Body-Worn Camera Mandates and Independent Oversight Commission. Daniel exchanged glances with Assistant U.S. Attorney Claire Morales, both knowing that their shared victory in court had set the stage for a broader reckoning. Across the room, state senators pressed questions about technical specifications, immutable logs that couldn't be tampered with, automatic flags for use of force incidents, a civilian review board with subpoena power. Daniel spoke quietly but firmly about the human stakes. Harold Greene's experience showed us that evidence matters, but only if it can't be erased. We owe it to every person who looks to the law for protection to build systems that can't be shut off by privilege or threat. Over the following weeks, Daniel found himself in hearing rooms long after morning bleachers emptied. He testified on drafting language that would require external auditors to inspect every sealed complaint, on creating digital locks that triggered alerts if evidence was altered, on mandating real-time uploads of body cam footage. Critics worried about costs and bureaucracy. Daniel responded with data from mid-sized cities that had already piloted such systems, pointing out how small investments in transparency led to significant reductions in misconduct claims. Each time he left the dais, his suit pressed, his notes held close. He carried with him a measure of guarded optimism, aware of how easily well-intentioned reforms could stall in legislative limbo. Meanwhile, in precincts across the region, internal affairs divisions saw a trickle of new complaints. No longer muffled by external interference, each report followed a clear path, a transparent track from filing to outcome, visible to both the complainant and an oversight board. Daniel heard of one sergeant who, after years of tolerating whispered rumors about a squad leader's heavy hand, finally submitted a formal allegation, including dashcam clips he'd archived in secret. He did so knowing the system could no longer swallow that evidence. The ripple reached a lieutenant in another suburb, who shared an article about the Greene precedent with his recruits, reminding them that citizenship and accountability were inseparable. On weekends, Daniel drove past the old courthouse on Winston Hill, where graffiti once defiled the steps now gave way to a different kind of art. A local muralist had painted a single blood-stained folder in vivid reds and browns, its edges chipped as though worn by countless hands, its paper ridges deep with texture. Onlookers paused to read the words spray-painted beneath it. Truth, filed, silence, broken. Families snapped photos. Teenagers tagged it for Instagram, and an elderly couple traced the outline of the folder with reverent fingertips. For Daniel, the mural was more than art. It was the public's acknowledgement that evidence once hidden could become its own guardian. In midnight, brainstorms with Claire and Laura Caldwell, now head of the Bureau's oversight unit, Daniel mapped the next phase, expanding the audit trail model to child protection agencies, security, and federal detention centers, even the lines of communication in domestic violence intervention teams. Each iteration built on the Carson case's lessons that secrecy breeds abuse, that silence can become consent, that a moment of courage by one man can reshape the path of many. As they logged their progress in encrypted shared drives, Daniel sensed a growing network of allies, academics refining encryption protocols, technologists designing tamper-evident storage devices, community advocates training civilians on how to file complaints and demand follow-through. Through it all, Harold Greene remained Daniel's lodestar. Weekly calls connected father and son across distance. Harold spoke of the local neighborhood watch forming around the courthouse, offering free legal clinics to those too intimidated to come forward. He wrote letters to the editor about the power of restraint and the necessity of witnessing. When Daniel pressed him to retire to step back from the spotlight, Harold would only smile and say, "I stood and adjusted my collar, son." That's all any man needs to do to remind the world who he is. Months turned into a year, and Carson's name receded from front-page news into legal archives marked case closed. His prison protests faded into bureaucratic reports, his appeals languishing like echoes in a vast empty hall. But the reforms endured. State governments adopted new evidence management systems. Grants funded upgrades in rural sheriff's offices, and federal legislative proposals included strict language ensuring that no judge or prosecutor could unilaterally seal abuse complaints ever again. On the anniversary of Harold's testimony, Daniel returned to Winston Hill for a small dedication ceremony at the mural. Community leaders, city officials, and civil rights activists gathered under a gray sky, one protest flag fluttering gently among them. Daniel spoke briefly into a handheld microphone, recalling his father's simple declaration, "I did not flinch. I simply stood and adjusted my collar." He told the crowd how that moment had taught him that power is not the right to break, but the strength to stand. He thanked the neighbors, the whistleblowers, the legislators, and every citizen who refused to look away. As applause rose, Daniel caught sight of Harold in the front row, cane in hand, eyes bright with a warmth that outshone any spotlight. The older man wore a dark suit, his service medallion gleaming as if newly pressed. When the crowd dispersed into light rain, warriors of accountability in civilian clothes and law enforcement uniforms walked side by side. Daniel and Harold lingered by the mural, tracing the folder's jagged outline with shared pride. "Looks good, doesn't it?" Harold said softly. "Better than I ever imagined," Daniel replied. He placed a hand on the mural's painted edge, a single stroke of crimson that spoke to every unseen file now preserved in digital stone. "It means work still to be done." Harold nodded, eyes drifting to the courthouse steps, now scrubbed clean, each stone a tribute to vigilance. "Then we keep standing," he said. "Adjust the collar and stand some more." As they walked away, the mural's message lingered in the air, an enduring testament that when restraint meets relentless truth, the law can indeed correct itself one frame of evidence at a time. And in that quiet legacy, Daniel found the promise of a system reborn not by spectacle or fury, but by the simple power of standing tall.